At exactly 6:47 a.m. on a calm Tuesday, the quiet perfection of Willowbrook Estates shattered with the sound of steel biting steel. One reckless act, a pair of bolt cutters slicing through a government security chain, marked the precise moment. Bethany Kensington Wright, self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, transformed from neighborhood tyrant to convicted felon. She thought she was enforcing community standards. Instead, she'd just committed a federal crime worth millions, and she didn't even know it yet. The metallic clang that echoed through the cul-de-sac that morning didn't just cut through my lock, it cut straight through her carefully curated illusion of power. See, while I was thousands of miles away on deployment tracking cartel shipments across foreign borders, Bethany decided my government-issued Jeep was an eyesore, unfit for her precious neighborhood aesthetic. What she didn't realize? That eyesore was a federally equipped task force vehicle containing $347,000 worth of surveillance and encrypted tech. And I'm not your average soldier. I'm Special Agent Marcus Tank Rodriguez, and my specialty is dismantling organized criminal networks. Unfortunately for her, she'd just become my next target. When my grandmother passed, I inherited her home in Willowbrook, a supposedly peaceful suburb with white fences, manicured lawns, and a $150 monthly HOA fee for the privilege of being controlled by self-righteous neighbors. Grandma Rose's home was more than property. It was a memory made of tortillas, warm laughter, and lessons about standing up to bullies the right way. But that lesson was about to be tested harder than ever. Bethany Kensington Wright, 52 years old, a real estate agent who drove a spotless white Lexus and ruled the HOA with a ruler, literally, was the self-appointed dictator of the subdivision. Her husband, Carl, sat on the city council, which made her feel untouchable. Together, they'd built a suburban empire powered by intimidation and false authority. 2 weeks after I shipped out, an email hit my inbox. HOA violation. Unauthorized commercial vehicle storage. Translation: Bethany didn't like my marked government Jeep in Grandma's driveway. She fined me $50 a day. What she ignored, or pretended not to know, was that the Jeep wasn't a personal car. It was federal property, assigned to me under the Department of Justice for active counter-narcotics operations. Moving it without clearance was a crime, but logic had no place in Bethany's kingdom. My sister Maya, a middle school teacher with more patience than anyone I know, tried to reason with her. She brought deployment papers, offered to cover the Jeep, even pleaded for understanding. Bethany's reply? A smug smile and a line I'll never forget. If your brother can't follow simple community standards, maybe this neighborhood isn't right for your family. That's when I knew it wasn't about the Jeep. It was about control. Maya started noticing a disturbing pattern. Every veteran or military family in Willowbrook had been violated for something. A Marine fined for a loud motorcycle, a Navy wife cited for unprofessional garden decor, a Gold Star family penalized for a flag that obstructed sightlines. But the real discovery came when Maya found an old letter in Grandma's files. Bethany had once petitioned the city to block military housing programs in Willowbrook, calling soldiers transient populations. She wasn't just drunk on power. She was actively discriminating against the people who serve this country. That was the moment the mission changed. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about justice. I contacted JAG, military lawyers who don't play around. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams reviewed my case and immediately escalated it. What Bethany had done, harassing the property of a deployed service member and threatening to confiscate federal equipment, wasn't an HOA issue. It was a federal offense under the Service Members Civil Relief Act and theft of government property. A military liaison review was launched, and suddenly, the self-appointed Queen of Willowbrook found herself on the radar of people who outranked her in every way imaginable. Bethany's response? Escalation. She doubled down, sending a formal letter to my home claiming the Jeep was a health and safety risk and authorizing emergency towing. She copied her husband, the police department, and code enforcement, wrapping her lies in layers of fake authority. But she didn't stop there. She hired private security, 2 wannabe cops in a white SUV, to patrol the neighborhood, circling my grandmother's home every hour, documenting my Jeep like it was a threat to national security. They even cornered Maya outside a grocery store, warning her that military vehicles can pose risks to the community. That was the final straw. I accessed my Jeep's onboard surveillance remotely. The footage stunned me. Bethany, flashlight in hand, sneaking onto my property at 1:43 a.m., taking pictures through my windows, trying to open my doors. Her security guards stood beside her, photographing federal tracking devices and encrypted comms. They weren't just trespassing. They were photographing classified surveillance hardware. That's espionage. When my task force supervisor, Captain Sarah Chen, saw the footage, she didn't mince words. "Rodriguez, how fast do you want me to make this woman's life difficult?" We launched an investigation overnight. ExecSafe Security lost their federal license before sunrise. Bethany didn't know it yet, but she'd crossed a line you don't come back from. Then came that fateful Tuesday morning. 6:47 a.m., bolt cutters. A tow truck idling at the curb. Maya's panicked voice over the phone. "Tank, she's cutting your locks and she's taking your Jeep." Bethany, still in her robe, waving cash at a tow truck driver who suddenly realized he was staring at a federal law enforcement vehicle. "This is abandoned property," she screamed. "No, ma'am," the driver stammered, backing away. "This is government equipment. I'm not touching it." Every second was caught on Maya's camera and 3 other home surveillance systems. Bethany's meltdown became Exhibit A in a federal case file before breakfast. The moment she cut that chain, the Jeep's internal alarm system sent an encrypted alert straight to Homeland Security databases. GPS trackers activated, cameras recorded, and response protocols were triggered. In less than 10 minutes, a joint task force, U.S. Marshals, federal agents, and local PD was en route to my address. And Bethany, she was still yelling about HOA authority while holding a pair of bolt cutters. When the marshals arrived, she refused to unlock the gate, trapping my Jeep inside. "He can get it back when he pays his fines," she shrieked. That statement alone, on video, sealed her fate. By 10 a.m., the neighborhood had transformed into a war zone of moral clarity. Veterans, neighbors, and families poured out of their houses. Mrs. Patterson, a widow who'd lost 2 sons in service, stood on her lawn with a flag in her hands. "You'll have to go through every one of us before you take that soldier's property," she declared. Dozens stood beside her. Marines, police officers, teachers, retirees. Maya stood at the center, voice trembling but proud, surrounded by a wall of American flags. The community she once ruled through fear had turned against her. Bethany was arrested on the spot, charged with theft of federal property, obstruction of a federal investigation, harassment of a service member, and trespassing on classified assets. Her political connections evaporated overnight. Even her husband couldn't save her. 8 years. That's the sentence she got for her community enforcement. And the irony? The same HOA that once backed her was forced to pay restitution, $2.3 million in damages and penalties. When I finally returned home, my Jeep still sat in Grandma's driveway, untouched since the day it was recovered. The neighbors welcomed me with flags, coffee, and quiet respect. Maya had her job back. The HOA had new leadership, this time led by veterans and families who knew what real community meant. Standing there in the morning light, I could almost hear Grandma Rose's voice. "Mijo, you stand up to bullies, but you do it the right way." And I did, because sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. Sometimes it starts with a soldier, a sister, a camera, and a neighborhood that finally remembers what it means to stand together. The day Bethany Kensington Wright was arrested, Willowbrook Estates stopped pretending to be perfect. The sound of police radios and the flash of blue and red lights bounced off the beige houses like the ghosts of secrets finally being dragged into daylight. The once pristine neighborhood that had prided itself on silence was now the center of a federal investigation that reached from City Hall all the way into the Justice Department. Neighbors peeked through blinds. News vans crowded the cul-de-sac. Reporters whispered words like espionage, federal theft, civil rights violation. But for me, 8,000 miles away in a war zone, the real noise was silence. The silence after the call disconnected, after I heard Maya's voice finally steady. "They took her away, Tank. It's over." But it wasn't over. It was just beginning. The aftermath. When I returned stateside 6 weeks later, Willowbrook looked the same. Perfect lawns, manicured shrubs, but something in the air had shifted. The illusion of control was gone. The smell of mulch and chlorine couldn't mask the quiet hum of fear and gossip. I parked across the street from Grandma's house before walking in. The door creaked just like it used to when she'd open it to hand me a plate of tamales. That smell, cinnamon and old wood, still clung to the walls. Maya sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, stacks of paperwork around her. She'd turned Grandma's old kitchen into a war room. "You made national news," she said, half smiling, half shaking her head. "They're calling it the HOA spy case. You're practically a meme." I laughed, but the truth hit hard. Reporters had turned it into a circus. Suburban Karen takes on federal agent. Catchy headline, but it missed the point. This wasn't entertainment. It was systemic corruption that nearly ruined people's lives. And the more we dug, the uglier it got. Sort the paper trail. Bethany had built a small empire on fear. Hidden in HOA financial statements were consulting fees, compliance expenses, and legal enforcement costs, all thinly disguised kickbacks to friends, contractors, and political donors. Maya found evidence that she'd been approving fake fines and funneling the money through shell accounts. Her husband Carl had signed off on multiple zoning permits that benefited their allies' development projects. Luxury condos, real estate ventures, community upgrades. It was all connected. And the discrimination against military families wasn't a side effect. It was strategy. Military homeowners, often deployed, couldn't defend themselves from fabricated violations. They'd sell out of frustration or fear, and the Wright's associates would scoop up the properties at below-market rates. It wasn't just harassment. It was organized fraud under the disguise of neighborhood improvement. The investigation. Federal agents swarmed the HOA office within days of her arrest. You could feel the tension ripple through Willowbrook. The Queen's castle had been stormed. Met with Captain Sarah Chen and Special Agent Collins from the DOJ's Inspector General's office at a coffee shop downtown. The air smelled of espresso and cheap redemption. "Rodriguez," Collins said, sliding a folder across the table, "you realize you just handed us a textbook case of civil rights violations, property fraud, and unlawful surveillance. But there's more." Bethany wasn't working alone. He opened the folder. Photos, emails, signatures. Carl Wright's name appeared everywhere. City zoning changes, campaign contributions, quiet approvals that benefited private investors connected to Bethany's HOA enforcement actions. She wasn't just overstepping her authority. She was part of a suburban corruption network, using community regulations to engineer property values and political power. The DOJ called it Operation Mulchfire. The name fit, as the community speaks. When federal indictments dropped, the neighborhood finally found its voice. Veterans, teachers, retirees, people who'd lived in fear of her, started coming forward. Mrs. Patterson, the widow who'd rallied the community that day, stood at a town meeting clutching her late son's folded flag. "She called my boy's memorial unprofessional yard decor," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "He died in Iraq. She fined me $50 a day for his memory." The room went silent. That's when I realized this wasn't just about my Jeep, or even the military. It was about every person who'd been silenced by arrogance wrapped in authority. The trial. 8 months later, the courtroom overflowed. Bethany Kensington Wright, designer dress, pearls, posture stiff with the weight of denial, stood before a federal judge as the charges were read. Theft of federal property, interference with national security, equipment, harassment of a deployed service, member civil rights violations, wire fraud, 5 counts, each carrying years. Her lawyer tried to paint it as a misunderstanding, a confused attempt to enforce community standards. But the prosecution shredded that argument like paper in a hurricane. They played the footage from Maya's phone. Bethany screaming, waving bolt cutters, ordering the tow truck to load my Jeep. They showed the GPS data, the security, footage of her trespassing at night, the emails where she bragged about making an example of military families. Each piece of evidence hit like a hammer. When it was my turn to testify, I looked her in the eyes and said, "You didn't just cut a chain. You cut through the integrity of what this country stands for." She didn't look away, but her hand trembled. The sentence. When the verdict came, it was swift. "Bethany Kensington Wright," the judge declared. "This court finds you guilty on all counts. You abused your position, targeted military families, and tampered with federal property. You are hereby sentenced to 8 years in federal prison." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Carl tried to stand, but security stopped him. His face was pale. His own indictment would come months later, for bribery and corruption. Bethany was led away in handcuffs, the click of her heels replaced by the rattle of chains. For the first time, Willowbrook felt quiet again. Not the fake manicured quiet of HOA perfection, but the real quiet that follows justice finally being served. Rebuilding Willowbrook. After the trial, the HOA board was dissolved under federal oversight. Elections were held for the first time in years. Maya was elected as interim secretary, alongside veterans, teachers, and families who believed in fairness over fear. We called it the Willowbrook Charter. It was simple. No one is above the rules, and no rule should exist to harm another human being. The new HOA dues went into community projects, playgrounds, scholarships for military kids, maintenance for elderly residents. Mrs. Patterson's son's memorial became the centerpiece of the new community garden. His flag flies there every day. Media, storm. The story spread far beyond our neighborhood. News anchors called it the suburban civil rights case of the decade. Congress members cited it in debates about military housing, discrimination. Veteran advocacy groups sent letters of support. Even the president mentioned it briefly during a speech about protecting those who protect us. But the real victory wasn't headlines or speeches. It was Maya walking back into her classroom with her head high. It was seeing the neighbors wave at each other again without fear. It was Grandma's old house filled with laughter instead of anxiety. 9. The visit. 1 year later, I received a letter, stamped with a federal correctional institution's seal. It was from Bethany. Mr. Rodriguez, I've had a year to think about what I did. At first, I told myself I was enforcing order, protecting standards. But now I see it was about control and fear. I saw your uniform and your Jeep as a threat to the image I'd built, because deep down I was jealous of people who actually served something bigger than themselves. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just understanding. I didn't reply. But I didn't hate her either. People like Bethany don't start out as villains. They just lose sight of where authority ends and decency begins. 10. Full circle. Every morning now, I walk Grandma's property line before sunrise. The air smells like wet earth and peace. The same Jeep, cleaned, repaired, still marked with the federal insignia, sits in the driveway where it belongs. The neighbors wave. Some salute. Kids ride bikes past the mailbox without their parents worrying about violations. Maya's new project, Operation Homefront Harmony, connects veterans with neighborhoods across the state to teach communities how to support deployed families, not punish them. And every 4th of July, the entire cul-de-sac gathers in front of Grandma's house for a cookout. Mrs. Patterson raises her flag. Tom Henderson tells his war stories. The kids light sparklers. And for the first time in years, Willowbrook Estates finally feels like home. Chauve. Epilogue. Lessons from a chain. People ask me all the time what I learned from this whole ordeal. I tell them this. Power doesn't corrupt. Fear does. And when fear hides behind authority, it becomes tyranny. But courage, real courage, doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a badge. Sometimes it's a schoolteacher with a camera phone, a widow with a flag, a neighborhood that decides enough is enough. Bethany's mistake wasn't cutting a chain. It was forgetting that the people she ruled were stronger than the paper she wrote her rules on. Grandma Rose used to say, "Mijo, you can't plant flowers in poisoned soil. You have to dig up the rot first." Because sometimes freedom isn't defended on foreign soil. Sometimes it's defended right in your own driveway.